He used to be the man people feared, until the day his own body stopped listening to him. The estate was quiet in a way that did not belong to wealth, a silence too controlled, too careful, as if every sound had been measured and reduced to avoid disturbing something fragile at its center, and in the middle of that stillness sat Vincent Moretti, once a name that carried weight across the city, now seated in a chair that defined the limits of his world, his posture straight but unmoving, his hands resting where they had learned to stay, and the morning light stretched across the marble floor toward him, stopping just short of his shoes as if even it hesitated to reach him fully, and around him, the house continued its routine without him, staff moving in quiet patterns, avoiding eye contact, speaking in lowered tones that carried not respect, but discomfort, because power had a shape they understood, and this was not it, and Vincent felt that difference without needing to look. It lived in the pauses, in the way footsteps slowed near him and then continued, in the absence of direct conversation, in the subtle shift from engagement to avoidance, and none of it surprised him anymore, because loss did not arrive all at once, it revealed itself piece by piece, in moments small enough to ignore until they became impossible to deny, and for a while he simply sat there, his gaze fixed ahead, not on anything in particular, but on the space where something used to exist, until he moved. Just slightly, his fingers pressing against the armrests, his shoulders tightening as he leaned forward, an action so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching closely, and he held there, suspended between effort and limitation, his body responding just enough to remind him what used to be possible, but not enough to follow through, and the moment stretched, quiet and stubborn, until it passed, leaving him exactly where he had started, and across the room, a staff member paused, watching for a fraction of a second before turning away quickly, as if witnessing that attempt required acknowledgement they were not prepared to give, and Vincent lowered his gaze just slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because this was not new, this was routine, and still, he did not call for assistance. Did not ask for help, because needing something had become a language he refused to speak, and the silence returned again, heavier now, more settled, until a different set of footsteps entered the space, not hurried, not hesitant, but steady in a way that felt out of place in a house that had learned to move carefully around him, and Vincent did not react immediately, because new presence rarely meant change. But these footsteps did not pass him, did not adjust or fade, they continued forward. Until they stopped within reach of his awareness, and after a moment, he lifted his gaze, not expecting anything, not preparing for interaction, and saw her, Lena Brooks, standing there without hesitation, her posture relaxed but grounded, her expression neutral in a way that held no trace of pity, no discomfort, no careful distance, and for a second, nothing happened, no greeting, no formal introduction, just a quiet exchange of presence, and then she spoke, her voice calm, direct, as if addressing someone exactly as they were, not as they had been or what they had lost. "Are you going to try again?" And the question did not soften itself, did not carry sympathy, it simply existed, clear and unfiltered, and Vincent looked at her, really looked this time, because for the first time since everything had changed, someone was not reacting to him, they were speaking to him, and that difference, subtle but undeniable, shifted something beneath the surface, something he had not expected to feel again, not hope, not yet, but something closer to recognition, and the room, for a brief moment, did not feel as heavy as it had before. Vincent did not answer her immediately, not because he did not understand the question, but because he was not used to hearing one like it, not anymore, not without the weight of concern or the careful tone people used when they believed he needed protection from his own reality, and Lena did not move while she waited, she did not fill the silence, did not soften the moment. She simply stood there as if time was not something that needed to be managed, and that alone set her apart from everyone else in the house, because everyone else adjusted around him, but she did not adjust at all, and that difference settled into the space between them in a way that demanded attention without asking for it, and Vincent finally shifted his gaze fully toward her, studying her with a quiet intensity that had once been used to read situations, to measure loyalty, to anticipate outcomes, and now it found something unfamiliar, something he could not immediately define, because she was not reacting to him as a man who had fallen, she was looking at him as if he were simply there, unchanged in the ways that mattered, and after a moment, he responded, his voice steady but lower than it had been in the past. "I already did, and the words carried a finality that suggested repetition without result, but Lena did not nod, did not accept that answer as complete. Instead she tilted her head just slightly, her expression remaining neutral. Then try again, she said, and there was no challenge in her tone, no encouragement either, just a statement, simple and direct. And for a brief second, something almost unrecognizable crossed Vincent's expression, not irritation, not resistance, but something closer to confusion, because no one had spoken to him like that since before everything had changed, and it unsettled him in a way that was not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. And around them, the staff had begun to notice, their movements slowing, their attention drawn quietly toward the interaction, because this was not how things were done, not in this house, not around him, and yet Lena remained exactly as she was, unbothered by the invisible rules that governed everyone else, and Vincent exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but as if resetting something within himself, and without looking away from her, he placed his hands firmly on the armrests again, his fingers tightening slightly, his shoulders lifting as he leaned forward once more, and this time, the effort was not hidden, not subtle, it was deliberate, controlled, and visible, and the room seemed to shift with him, not physically, but in attention, as if everything around them had paused just enough to witness what would happen next, and Lena did not step in, did not offer support, did not move closer, she simply watched, her presence steady but uninvolved, and that absence of assistance did something unexpected, it removed the expectation of failure, because there was no one there to catch him, no one there to soften the outcome, only the moment itself, and Vincent pushed, his body responding in the only way it could, limited, restrained, but not entirely still. And for a fraction of a second, something changed, not enough to call it success, but enough to feel different, enough to register, and then the motion stopped again, his body settling back into the chair, the attempt incomplete but not identical to the one before, and the silence that followed was not the same either. It did not carry disappointment, it carried awareness, and Lena nodded once, not in approval, not an encouragement, but an acknowledgement. You moved more, she said simply. And the words landed in a way that did not inflate the moment, did not exaggerate it, but recognized it exactly as it was, and Vincent felt that recognition settle somewhere deeper than he expected, because it was not about what he could not do, it was about what had changed, however small, and for the first time in a long while, the space around him did not feel like something to endure, it felt like something that might respond, and across the room, the staff member who had been watching turned away again, but this time, not out of discomfort, but out of something closer to uncertainty, because what they were seeing did not fit the pattern they had grown used to, and Vincent remained still for a moment longer, his gaze still on Lena, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, not stronger, not louder, but steadier in a way that suggested something had shifted. What is your name? And Lena met his gaze without hesitation. Lena, she replied, and the simplicity of the exchange marked something subtle but undeniable, because for the first time since she had entered the room, the distance between them had changed, not in position, but in recognition, and in that quiet moment, without announcement, without effort, something had begun. The name settled into the space between them with a quiet permanence, not because it carried authority, but because it carried identity, something Vincent had not fully acknowledged in anyone around him for a long time, and he repeated it once in his mind, not aloud, as if testing how it fit into the new structure of his world, and Lena did not react to the silence that followed, she did not fill it, did not expect anything from it, she simply remained where she was, grounded in a way that did not shift based on his response, and that steadiness continued to disrupt the pattern of the house, because everyone else moved according to him, but she did not move at all, and Vincent noticed that more with each passing second, not as defiance, but as something else, something closer to independence, and it drew his attention in a way he had not expected, and after a moment, he adjusted slightly in the chair, not to attempt standing again, but to reorient himself toward her fully, because the interaction no longer felt incidental, it felt intentional, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less distance than before. You are new, he said, and Lena gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. First day, she replied, and there was no introduction beyond that, no explanation, no attempt to establish position or justify her presence, and Vincent found himself pausing again, because in a house where roles were clearly defined, her lack of Explanation created something undefined, something he could not immediately place, and that uncertainty held his attention longer than it should have, and around them, the staff continued their work, but more carefully now, their awareness heightened, because the interaction had not ended as quickly as they expected, and the longer it continued, the more it shifted the balance of what they understood, and Vincent leaned back slightly, his hands relaxing just enough to signal a pause rather than an end, and his gaze moved briefly toward the window, where the light had shifted again, stretching further into the room, touching the edges of furniture but still not fully reaching him, and he watched it for a second before returning his attention to Lena, as if recalibrating his focus, and when he spoke again, the question came without preface, "Why are you not afraid?" And the room seemed to still once more, not because the question was loud, but because it was unexpected, and Lena did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but as if considering whether the question required more than the obvious, and then she spoke, her tone the same as before, steady, unaffected, "Because you are still here," and the simplicity of it landed in a way that did not allow for interpretation, because it reframed everything without denying any of it, and Vincent held her gaze for a moment longer, the words settling deeper than he anticipated, because they did not ignore his condition, they did not pretend it did not exist, but they also did not define him by it, and that distinction was something he had not heard, not clearly, not without the weight of sympathy attached to it, and something in his posture shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the space he occupied had expanded just slightly beyond the limits he had accepted, and Lena remained still, not reacting to that shift, not acknowledging it, because for her, nothing had changed, and that consistency created a contrast that continued to build, and after a moment, Vincent exhaled slowly, not as release, but as adjustment, and his gaze moved once more around the room, taking in the quiet movement of the staff, the careful distance they maintained, the way they avoided direct interaction unless necessary, and then he returned his attention to Lena, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not strength, not authority, but curiosity, and it changed the dynamic between them in a way that no one else in the room could fully see, but everyone could feel, and Lena noticed it, not in detail, but in presence, and she did not respond to it, because her role had not changed in her mind. She was there to do a job, nothing more, nothing less, and yet, something had already begun to move beyond that definition, something neither of them had named, and the room, once again, adjusted around it without understanding why. The question lingered long after it was answered, not because it needed more words, but because it had already said enough, and Vincent found himself sitting differently in the silence that followed, not physically, but in the way he occupied the moment, as if something had shifted just enough to make the room feel less like a place he was confined to and more like a space he could still influence, even if only in small ways, and Lena did not acknowledge that shift, she did not react to it. Because for her nothing had changed, she was still standing in the same place, still carrying the same calm, and that consistency continued to define her presence in a way that made everything else in the room feel less certain, and after a moment, she moved, not toward him, not to assist, but to continue with what she had come to do, her steps quiet but direct as she crossed to the nearby table, adjusting items that did not need adjustment, not out of obligation, but out of rhythm, and Vincent watched her for a second, noticing how she did not rush, did not perform for the room, did not seek approval from anyone watching, and that lack of performance made her stand out more than any effort would have, and across the room, one of the senior staff approached slowly, their posture formal, their tone controlled. "Mr. Moretti, your schedule for today," they began, but Vincent did not look at them immediately, his attention still partially anchored to Lena, as if the conversation that had just taken place had not fully concluded, and when he finally turned his gaze, it was not with the same automatic authority it once carried, but with something more deliberate, something chosen, and he listened without interruption as the schedule was outlined, meetings postponed, calls rescheduled, routines adjusted to accommodate a life that no longer moved at the same pace, and each detail was delivered with care, but also with a subtle distance, as if the person speaking had already accepted that Vincent was no longer part of those decisions in the same way, and that realization settled quietly into the space, not as something new, but as something confirmed, and when the explanation ended, there was a pause, a moment where a response was expected, and Vincent remained still for a second longer than usual, his gaze shifting briefly toward Lena again before returning to the staff member. "Cancel it," he said, his voice calm, not raised, but carrying a clarity that did not invite negotiation, and the staff member hesitated, just slightly, enough to reveal that this was not the expected answer, but they nodded quickly. "Of course, sir," and stepped back, the interaction ending without further discussion, and Lena glanced toward him then, not in surprise, not in approval, just in acknowledgement, as if noting a change without needing to comment on it, and Vincent met her gaze for a brief moment, and there was something unspoken there, something that did not need to be defined yet, and then she looked away, returning to her task, because for her, the moment did not require continuation, it simply existed, and the room adjusted once more, subtly, as if recognizing that something had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to alter the rhythm of everything around it, and Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting more loosely now, not gripping the armrests as tightly as before, and he looked out toward the window again, the light now fully inside the room, reaching further than it had earlier, touching the edges of where he sat, and for a moment, he watched it without thinking, without analyzing, just observing, and that simple act felt different, quieter, less burdened, and behind him, Lena moved through the space with the same steady pace, her presence no longer something that disrupted the room, but something that redefined it, and without either of them acknowledging it directly, a new pattern had begun to form, one that did not follow the rules that had governed the house before, one that did not rely on what Vincent had lost, but on what still remained, and in that quiet shift, something deeper than routine had started to take hold, something that would not announce itself, but would continue to grow in the spaces between words, between actions, in the way they looked at each other and the way they did not need to explain why. The decision to cancel everything did not echo loudly through the house, but it moved through it all the same, subtle and undeniable, carried in the way staff adjusted their schedules, in the quiet shift of priorities that no one questioned out loud, because even now, even in this altered state, Vincent's words still held weight, just not in the way they once had, and as the morning stretched into midday, the light settled fully across the room, no longer hesitating at the edges, now reaching him without interruption, and he remained where he was, but not entirely the same, his posture less rigid, his hands no longer fixed in place as if holding on to something that had already slipped away, and across the room, Lena moved with the same steady rhythm, her presence now woven into the space rather than standing apart from it, and she approached him again, not with urgency, not with ceremony, but with the same calm directness that had defined her from the beginning, holding a glass of water in one hand and a folded cloth in the other, and she stopped just within reach, placing the glass on the small table beside him without asking, without waiting for acknowledgement, as if the act itself was enough, and Vincent glanced at it briefly before looking back at her, and there was no resistance in that look, no rejection, only a quiet acceptance of what was being offered, and he reached for the glass slowly, his movement controlled, deliberate, and when his fingers wrapped around it, there was a slight pause, not because he could not hold it, but because the act itself felt different, something he had once done without thought now carried a weight he could not ignore, and Lena watched without stepping in, her presence steady but not intrusive, allowing the moment to exist without interference, and Vincent lifted the glass, the motion small but complete, and when he took a sip, the room did not react. No one acknowledged it, but something in the air shifted all the same, because small victories, when witnessed without pity, became something else entirely, and he set the glass down carefully, his hand lingering for a second longer before releasing it, and Lena nodded once, not in praise, not in encouragement, but in recognition, the same way she had before, and that consistency grounded the moment in a way that did not allow it to become more than it was, and yet, it was enough. And Vincent leaned back slightly, his gaze moving toward her again, and there was something in it now that had not been there earlier, something quieter, something less guarded, and when he spoke, his voice carried that shift. "You do not treat me like the others do," and Lena met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "Because you are not the same as they think you are," she replied, and the words settled between them with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and Vincent held her gaze for a moment longer, the meaning of it reaching deeper than he expected, because it did not deny what had changed, but it refused to define him by it, and that distinction continued to reshape something within him, slowly, steadily, without force, and across the room, the staff continued their work, but their movements had begun to reflect a different awareness, less cautious, less distant, as if the presence that had once defined the space was returning in a new form, not through command, but through something quieter, something that did not demand attention but still held it, and Lena stepped back slightly then, not leaving, but giving space in a way that did not feel like withdrawal, and Vincent watched her for a second as she moved, noticing again how she did not look back to check if he needed anything, did not hover, did not wait for instruction, and that independence continued to draw his attention in a way he could not ignore, and for the first time since everything had changed, the room did not feel like something he was placed inside, it felt like something he was part of again, even if only in small ways, and as the light continued to shift, moving slowly across the floor and up the walls, the silence that remained was no longer heavy, it was steady, and in that steadiness, something had begun to take shape, something neither of them had named yet, but both had already started to recognize. By late afternoon, the rhythm of the house had settled into something quieter, more natural, as if the tension that once defined every movement had slowly dissolved into a steadier pace, and Vincent remained near the window where the light had shifted into a softer tone, no longer sharp, no longer intrusive, but warm in a way that filled the space without demanding attention, and he watched it for a while, not because it held meaning, but because it no longer felt empty, and that alone marked a change he could not ignore, and behind him, Lena moved through the room with the same calm presence, adjusting small details, maintaining order without disrupting the stillness that had begun to form, and when she approached him again, it was not with anything in her hands this time, not with a task to complete, but simply to stand beside him, close enough to be present, not close enough to impose, and Vincent noticed that immediately, the absence of purpose in her movement standing out more than any action would have, and after a moment, he spoke, his voice carrying a quiet curiosity that had grown over the course of the day. "You do not seem to need anything from this place," and Lena turned her head slightly toward him, considering the question without urgency, before responding in the same steady tone she had maintained from the beginning. "I am here to do my job," she said, and the answer was simple, but it did not fully explain what he had observed, and Vincent held her gaze for a second longer, as if searching for something beneath the words, and when he spoke again, there was something more personal in his voice, something that had not been there before. "Most people here are not," and Lena did not deny it, did not confirm it, she simply let the statement settle, because it did not require response, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not uncertain, not heavy, it was comfortable in a way that neither of them had planned, and Vincent shifted slightly in his chair, his hands resting more loosely now, and he looked forward again, his gaze no longer fixed, no longer distant, but engaged with the space around him in a way that suggested he was beginning to see it differently, and after a moment, Lena spoke again, her voice calm but direct. "You are thinking too far ahead," and Vincent glanced back at her, a faint trace of something almost like amusement touching his expression. "I used to plan everything," he replied, and Lena nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that without elevating it, "and now," she said, "you just need to focus on what you can do next," and the words landed with the same clarity as everything else she had said, not as advice, not as instruction, but as a simple redirection, and Vincent considered it for a moment, not resisting, not questioning, but adjusting to it in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and without announcing it, without drawing attention, he placed his hands on the armrests again, not with the tension from earlier, but with a steadier intention, and Lena did not step back, did not step forward, she remained exactly where she was, her presence unchanged, and Vincent leaned forward slightly, his movement controlled, deliberate, and though the result was not dramatic, not complete, it was different, more stable, more certain, and for a brief second, he held there, not suspended between effort and failure as before, but balanced in a way that suggested something new, something still forming, and then he settled back again, the motion ending without strain, and the silence that followed carried something lighter, something that did not weigh on the room but rested within it, and Lena nodded once more, the same quiet acknowledgement she had given before, and Vincent let out a slow breath, not as release, but as recognition, because what had changed was not his condition, not the limits placed on him, but the way he moved within them, and that difference, though small, had begun to shift everything else around it, and as the light continued to fade into the early evening, casting longer shadows across the floor, the space between them no longer felt undefined, it felt intentional, shaped not by what either of them expected, but by what had already begun to take root, quietly, steadily, without force, and neither of them spoke again for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said, only something that needed to continue, and in that stillness, something deeper than routine, deeper than obligation, had begun to form, something that neither of them had named, but both had already started to feel. The evening air settled gently against the windows, softening the edges of the room as the last traces of daylight gave way to a quieter glow, and Vincent remained where he was, but something about the way he held himself had changed, not in posture alone, but in presence, as if the space no longer pressed against him in the same way, and Lena stood nearby, not watching him directly, not waiting for anything, but present in the way she had been all day, steady and unshaken, and the silence between them no longer carried uncertainty, it carried familiarity, something built not through words, but through the absence of what had once filled the room, and for a long moment, nothing moved, until the sound of heels echoed faintly from the far hallway, sharp, deliberate, cutting through the quiet with a confidence that did not belong to the calm that had settled there, and Vincent's gaze shifted slightly, not immediately, but enough to acknowledge that something had entered the space that did not match what had been building, and the sound grew closer, each step precise, intentional, until the figure appeared at the entrance, framed by the fading light behind her, Victoria Moretti, dressed in elegance that spoke of a life untouched by the changes within these walls, her posture straight, her expression composed but distant, as if she were stepping into a place she remembered, not one she understood, and for a second, the room seemed to hesitate, caught between what it had become and what it used to be, and Vincent did not react outwardly, but something in his stillness sharpened, not with tension, but with awareness, and Lena turned her head slightly, her gaze moving toward the doorway, her expression unchanged, but her presence becoming more defined, more grounded, as if instinctively anchoring herself in the space, and Victoria's eyes moved across the room, taking in the details, the arrangement, the quiet, until they landed on Vincent, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed through her expression, not shock, not warmth, but calculation, and then her gaze shifted again, settling on Lena, and the contrast between them became immediate, unspoken but undeniable, and Victoria took a few steps forward, her pace measured, her attention no longer divided, and when she spoke, her voice carried a familiarity that did not match the distance in her eyes. "Vincent," she said, and the name echoed differently now, not as authority, not as command, but as something being tested, and Vincent held her gaze for a moment, not responding immediately, because the weight of that voice no longer held the same place it once did, and Lena remained still, not stepping back, not stepping forward, her presence unchanged despite the shift in the room, and Victoria's eyes flickered briefly between them, the connection subtle but visible, and something in her posture tightened, just slightly, as if the image before her did not align with what she expected to find, and the silence stretched, filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had been left behind, and when Vincent finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying none of the hesitation that might have once been there. "You came back," and the statement was simple, without accusation, without welcome, and Victoria tilted her head just slightly, her expression smoothing into something more controlled. "Of course I did," she replied, as if the answer required no further explanation, and her gaze returned briefly to Lena, lingering just long enough to acknowledge her presence, and in that moment, the difference between them was not in status, not in position, but in something quieter, something rooted deeper, and Lena did not react to the look, did not shift under it, she remained exactly where she was, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, and Vincent noticed that, the way she did not move, did not adjust, and something in his gaze shifted again, not toward Victoria, but toward Lena, as if the center of the room had already been redefined, and Victoria took another step forward, her presence filling the space in a way that had once been natural, but now felt slightly out of place, and the room held its breath once more, not in anticipation, but in recognition that something had just entered that would test everything that had quietly begun to form, and in that moment, nothing had been decided yet, nothing had been spoken fully, but the balance had already begun to tilt, not toward the past, but toward something that had taken shape without permission, without announcement, and would not be easily undone. The room did not erupt, not in sound, not in movement, but in something quieter, something far more controlled, as if every person present understood that what was unfolding did not require noise to be felt, and Victoria stood there, her presence still sharp, still defined by a world that had not changed for her, but the space around her no longer responded the way it once would have, and that difference revealed itself not in confrontation, but in absence, in the lack of immediate adjustment. The lack of deference, the lack of reaction she had expected without needing to ask for it, and her gaze shifted once more toward Lena, this time more directly, more deliberately, as if trying to place her within a structure that no longer held, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a slight edge beneath its calm surface. Who is she? And the question did not come from curiosity, it came from assumption, from a position that expected explanation, and Vincent did not answer immediately, not because he hesitated, but because the question itself no longer held the same authority it once did, and Lena remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, not defensive, not reactive, simply present, and that presence alone altered the weight of the moment, because it refused to conform to what was being implied, and after a brief pause, Vincent spoke, his voice steady, controlled, and clear in a way that left no space for misinterpretation. She is here, he said, and the simplicity of the answer shifted the focus entirely, not defining Lena by role, not reducing her to position, but acknowledging her existence without qualification, and Victoria's expression tightened slightly, not in visible anger, but in something more restrained, something that did not align with the response she expected, and she took another step forward, her attention narrowing. You hired someone without telling me, she said, and the statement carried an assumption that had once been true, but now felt out of place, and Vincent held her gaze without moving, his expression unchanged. You were not here, he replied, and the words did not rise, did not push, they simply settled, and in that settling, they carried more weight than any argument could have, and the room seemed to pause around them, not because of tension, but because of recognition, because something fundamental had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by presence alone, and Victoria's eyes flickered for a moment, the smallest break in her composure, as if recalibrating the situation, and then her gaze returned to Lena, this time sharper, more defined, and in that look, the contrast became undeniable, not in status, not in appearance, but in something quieter, something rooted deeper, and Lena did not respond to it, did not lower her gaze, did not adjust her posture. She remained exactly as she had been from the moment she entered the room, and that stillness created a line that could not be crossed without acknowledgement, and Vincent noticed it, the way Lena did not move, the way she did not yield to the shift in energy, and something in his own posture aligned with that, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the way his presence held steady, refusing to be redirected, and Victoria exhaled slowly, her composure returning to the surface, but something beneath it had changed, something less certain, and when she spoke again, her voice carried less assumption, more calculation. I came back for us, she said, and the words hung in the air, waiting to be received, waiting to be accepted, but the room did not move toward them, did not respond, and Vincent remained still for a moment longer, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, and when he spoke, it was not with resistance, not with rejection, but with clarity. You came back now, he said, and the distinction in the words was quiet but unmistakable, and Victoria held his gaze, searching for something that was no longer there, something she had expected to find unchanged, and in that moment, the imbalance revealed itself fully, not through conflict, not through raised voices, but through the absence of alignment, and Lena remained where she was, her presence still grounded, still unchanged, and the space around her continued to reflect that steadiness, and Vincent's gaze shifted briefly toward her, not for confirmation, not for support, but in recognition of something that had already been established without words, and when his attention returned to Victoria, the room understood, not through declaration, but through the quiet shift in where he chose to stand, even without moving at all. The silence that followed did not demand resolution, it did not push for a decision to be spoken aloud, because something far more definitive had already taken place in the way Vincent held himself, in the way his gaze no longer searched for alignment where it once expected it, and Victoria stood there, still composed, still present, but no longer centered in the space she had once occupied so naturally, and the difference was not dramatic, it was not loud, it was simply undeniable, and she felt it, not through what was said, but through what was no longer offered, the absence of reassurance, the absence of return, and for a brief moment, her posture remained unchanged, as if holding on to a version of the room that no longer existed, and then something within that stillness shifted, subtle but visible, a recognition that what she had come back to was not waiting for her in the way she had assumed. And Vincent did not rush to fill that realization, he did not explain, did not justify, he simply remained where he was, steady, grounded, and in that steadiness, his position became clear without needing to be declared, and Lena stood beside him, not closer, not further, her presence unchanged, not claiming space, not retreating from it, simply existing in it with a certainty that did not require validation, and the room, once again, adjusted around that quiet alignment, not through movement, but through awareness, as if everyone present understood that something had just been decided without needing to be spoken, and Victoria's gaze moved once more between them, slower this time, more deliberate, and for the first time since she entered, there was no calculation in it, only recognition, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, not weakened, but stripped of the expectation it once carried. "You have changed," she said, and Vincent held her gaze, not denying it, not confirming it, simply allowing the statement to exist, and after a moment, he responded. His voice calm, even, but carrying a quiet certainty that had not been there before. "I had to," and the words did not carry accusation, they did not assign blame, but they drew a line that could not be crossed by returning, and Victoria absorbed that, not visibly, not outwardly, but in the way her posture shifted just slightly, the smallest release of something that had been held too tightly, and the room remained still, not waiting for more, not expecting continuation, because the moment had already reached its conclusion, and Lena glanced toward Vincent briefly, not for direction, not for confirmation, but an acknowledgement of what had just passed, and Vincent met that glance for a fraction of a second, and in that exchange, something deeper settled, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and then she looked forward again, her presence returning to its steady baseline, and Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting more loosely than they had at any point before, and he turned his gaze toward the window once more, where the night had fully taken over, the reflection of the room faintly visible against the glass, and in that reflection, the arrangement was clear, not in hierarchy, not in status, but in alignment, and behind him, Victoria stood for a moment longer, as if deciding whether there was anything left to say, anything left to reclaim, but the space did not offer it, and after a quiet breath, she turned, her movement smooth, controlled, and walked back the way she had come, her step still measured, but no longer carrying the same certainty, and the sound of her heels faded into the distance, leaving the room exactly as it had become, not returning to what it was, not shifting again, simply holding its new shape, and Vincent remained where he was, not watching her leave, not needing to, because his attention had already settled elsewhere, and Lena stood beside him, unchanged, unshaken, her presence still grounded in the same quiet strength that had altered everything without force, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said, and in that silence, something final settled into place, something that did not require approval, did not seek validation, it simply existed, and that night, without noise, without declaration, a man who had lost everything chose what still remained, and in doing so, he did not stand again, but he stood for something, and the world around him, quietly, shifted to match it.